Professor David Dulio of Oakland University and the director of the Oakland University Center for Civic Engagement. Dave, thank you for being with us today.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So how are you? How's your team? How's your family?
Oh, we're all good. Living the quarantine dream.
Hey, aren't we all?
You said it.
Yeah. Professor David Dulio, what is the current state of political rhetoric in the state of Michigan in the wake of COVID-19?
Well, the rhetoric is off the charts on both sides. And I think that hearing Professor Navin, as I caught the last 10 minutes or so of his conversation, and I think he nailed it on a number of issues. The rhetoric that we have, I think, is it's gotten more extreme, which is kind of hard to believe when we think back to the last couple of election cycles, 2018, 2016. I thought it was pretty bad, but it seems like it's just gotten worse.
And I would agree with that. I think that we've become more polarized, and I think that politics has inundated our usual conversation, our usual vernacular, and just the way that we relate to one another more than ever recently. From what you observe as a professor of political science, is it more toxic now than it ever has been, our political landscape?
Well, yes and no, right? Anecdotally, I think that we're in complete agreement that it's ratcheted up pretty dramatically. But it really depends, and I'll sound like a social scientist here, right? It depends on what measure you use to determine polarization. If we were to take just the rhetoric that we've been talking about, I think anecdotally, it's easy to say yes, but we don't really have anything to compare. We do have some data on, and it's good data, I think, on congressional polarization, or how far apart the two parties have been ideologically over the years. And it certainly has seen a dramatic increase in the last 45 or 50 years. From a time in the late 60s, early 70s, where it was at a really low point, where there were a lot more instances of Democrats voting with Republicans, Republicans voting with Democrats, in maybe not necessarily a bipartisan way, but at least you had folks who were sort of crossing over to support policies that the other party offered up. We certainly don't see that anymore these days. It's political scientists would call it party unity, right? And we see that party unity these days in Congress, and I think anecdotally, I would say it spills over into the state legislature as well. Both parties are terribly, terribly cohesive right now. They are all together, where you only see a few instances of what we would call defectors, right? Where they don't vote with their party. And that kind of polarization that we have now was also present at the turn of the 20th century. In the early 1900s, we were at a very high level of polarization then, and we came out of it, and it's just sort of cyclical.
It is cyclical. We've seen it before. We saw it at the onset of the United States government. We saw it definitely in the wake of the Civil War, in the wake of Vietnam, and even in the wake of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars at the tail end of the Bush administration. One thing that wasn't necessarily as prevalent in those scenarios as it is now is social media, and the ability for people to spread their opinions more broadly, for more people to have more voices in the news, in politics. How has social media impacted the use of political rhetoric by both parties, and how's that spilled over into our political landscape in the U.S. today?
I think it's been a net negative, to be honest with you. I think that there's no question that people say things on social media that they would never say face to face with somebody. The name calling, the vitriol, and I think Mark in the previous segment was right again when he talked about not painting everybody with the same brush. And I think that social media is where that happens a lot, and it's something that doesn't help, right? I mean, when everybody's put in their own box by the other side, people get defensive, and then they retaliate back, and it ratchets things up.
In terms of being politically sound, morally and ethically sound as well, is inflammatory rhetoric in these cases, especially today and with the issues that we're facing, is inflammatory rhetoric in the case of my side's better than your side, or you did this and so you're wrong, or you did this and that makes you a bad person, so to speak. Is inflammatory rhetoric okay as long as the politician gets what a politician or a party gets what they want, don't get caught using inflammatory rhetoric or being inflammatory in any case? And if they do, if there is a case where they get caught or they are clearly being inflammatory to get their way, how do they work around what do politicians do when they get caught up to work around that?
Well, I think that I think we could look at a number of examples and find deflection, right? And I don't think it's okay. I think that somebody would say, well, there's freedom of speech in the United States. We have this great First Amendment. Fair enough. But just because you can say something doesn't mean you should, right? I think that that's a lot of folks that are on social media, a lot of folks that are engaged in ratcheted up rhetoric need to just take it down a couple of notches. And I think that would help. I think that would help quite a bit.
One of those gatekeepers in between inflammatory rhetoric and productive political discourse is the media. It's one of the general roles of the media is to be a gatekeeper for information, to be a check and a balance against the powers that be. When a politician is pushing party rhetoric, or when someone's pushing inflammatory rhetoric at the expense of facts or as a tool to change the public perception of other leaders, is it the media's job to call that out, especially in today's media?
Sure. I think that it needs to be done so that we have some kind of sense of what is correct and what is not. And I think that today there's even a debate about that. And that's not terribly healthy either. But I'd also say, too, that it's incumbent upon journalists to do it in a fair and even manner and call out one side just as much as they call out the other when it's warranted. And I think that there are a lot of folks in the United States, a lot of folks in Michigan, who would say that doesn't happen.
So would you say, with that being the case, that those in the media, that those on news media in particular, the cable networks and even local news, would you say that they're filling that role effectively or ineffectively?
I think that depends who you ask, and I think that depends on the issue that we're talking about. I think that, like anything, it's not a yes or a no answer. I think that there's a spectrum, and I think we could find positives and we could find negatives in everybody's behavior and the job that they have done over the last several months and even the last several years.
And maybe this plays a role in the issues on that note, is that there are these cable networks that are very much leaning one way or another. Sure. MSNBC very much leans to the left. Fox News very much leans to the right. CNN kind of wavers in between, but has generally, as of late, been a little more left-leaning. With there being so much political media today, how can a general viewer or a listener or someone consuming all this media navigate the political rhetoric and get a better view, so to speak, or the full picture of the political landscape?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's an important one that all citizens need to take seriously, because we have this era of information driven by the press that is, we're in this segmented media landscape, and which is also a landscape where people can gravitate to the kind of information that they like, and things and information that confirms what they already believe, and that plays a part in people being more entrenched in their own views, their own bubble, as I like to think about it, right? If you only read the New York Times, watch CNN and MSNBC, that's not a full picture, right? There, for the reasons you mentioned. If you only watch Fox News and read the Wall Street Journal, you're not getting the full picture. I think what we all need to do when we consume information is read a lot of sources and find sources that and challenge ourselves, challenge our our desire to confirm our own biases and confirm our own beliefs, and read, if you're a conservative, read something from The Nation and see what the left is saying. If you're somebody on the left, read the National Review. And again, as Professor Navin was talking about, the folks that write at those outlets, they're not evil people. They just have a different perspective, and that's okay. It's not wrong. You may disagree with it, but somebody that writes one thing or another that you don't disagree with, they're not the devil. They just have a different perspective. And I think that it would benefit all of us to do a better job of exposing ourselves to different opinions, different ideas that really challenge what we already hold to be true.
Professor David Dulio, professor of political science at Oakland University and their director of Oakland University's Center for Civic Engagement, with us on the Megacast. In terms of the polarization and in terms of the tension that we have in Lansing right now and in Washington, with our current state of affairs, the way we communicate, the way that we consume news, do you ever see that polarization fading away or going back to some sort of common middle ground as we've had in the past? And how do we maybe get there with the constraints of today's society?
Well, I think as we talked about before, there's cycles, right? And if we let the data that we have from history inform us, I'd be confident to say that there's a cycle of a downward point of polarization on its way. When that happens, I have no idea. How long the current state will last, your guess is as good as mine. But I think that it's coming. And I forgot the second part of your question.
You covered.
How do we get to it? Right. So,
right.
I think it takes. If we're talking about the legislature or the governor's office, not the folks that are in those seats, but if we're talking about the generic legislatures, generic governors, members of Congress who are on different sides, it takes political will, right? It's very easy to engage in a political strategy that is driven by one's base, because there are opportunities to win control of government, win seats in the legislature, win a governor's office, a mayor's seat, whatever it might be, with just your base. There are ways to do that, and there are places in Michigan and across the country where that is more possible today than in the past. So I think it takes a lot of political courage to move beyond just your base and trying to just appeal to your base. And reach out to those who are on the other side in a genuine manner, and be able to say to your base, hey, look, just because I'm talking to these folks, just because I'm working with somebody from a different district who has different views than I do, lay off me for that. It's okay to engage in a bipartisan consensus building strategy.
Bringing this to all this to an issue locally in the state of Michigan, we have a battle going on, a constitutional crisis, frankly, between the governor and the legislature.
Yeah.
The legislature
Sure.
suing the governor, claiming that her powers being taken under 1945 and 1976 acts, the Emergency Management Act and the Emergency Powers of the Governor Act, are overstepping them and knocking out one of the checks and balances in the three branches of our government. In terms of all that we've spoken about today and what we currently have gotten from that case, from the arguments from both sides, the governor's side and the legislature's side, how has political rhetoric played a role in that so far? How will it continue to play a role in that as it goes forward?
Well, I think the rhetoric is going to stop at some point, because the Supreme Court is going to tell us who's right, or at least who has got a greater constitutional foundation on which to stand. And I think that at that point, I hope that both sides will be able to accept that decision and move on under those whatever circumstances the Supreme Court leaves us with.
Yeah,
and a good test case is going to be what happens in Wisconsin, right? I mean, a similar process played out where the Supreme Court struck down the stay-at-home order, and we're going to see over the next couple of weeks how that state deals with that.
It is going to be interesting to see where this goes and how all this is impacted by political rhetoric, but also by the current landscape of our political discourse overall. Regardless, this constitutional crisis will be resolved likely by the state Supreme Court. Even Judge Stevens, who oversaw the Court of Claims case, had said that she expects her big bosses, so to speak, referring to the Supreme Court, to oversee that. So, David Dullio, professor of political science at Oakland University. You're also the director of the Oakland University Center for Civic Engagement. We got just a couple more minutes here, just a few more minutes. Can you go ahead and explain what the Oakland University Center for Civic Engagement is and what role it plays in the community?
Sure. Well, we started the center for multiple purposes, and it really is. It's a sign that things were bad before, right? And I'll come back to how the current COVID crisis has impacted us. But one of the things that we want to do is have Oakland University become known as a convener of conversations about important public issues. And that's important to do in the right way. And what we want to do is when we have those conversations, have them in a civil and respectful and deliberative manner so that they can be productive and get people together who disagree, but do so in a way that is constructive, right? And do it in a way that helps people figure out what maybe the best policy solution is moving forward. And what we want to do is gather people together on these issues of public importance and create a venue where those kinds of discussions can happen. That's really at the center of what we do. How we do that in the next year or so, or at least in terms of how long we're dealing with COVID-19, remains to be seen. We're still going to try to figure that out. But you will see stuff from us coming in the fall semester as we lead up into an election, without doubt, critically important election. And we're just going to have to figure out how to do it like everybody else in the current state.
Professor David Dullio, political science professor at Oakland University and the director of their Center for Civic Engagement. You talk about creating an environment for productive conversation between people of various points of view. How do you facilitate that being productive and not turning into a shouting match or turning into a finger-pointing competition? And how can we apply that better to our general political discourse outside of the Center for Civic Engagement?
Sure. So one of the things we did as we launched the center in the fall of 2018 was work with our advisory boards. We have two. We have a founding advisory board that is made up of alumni and folks from the community, as well as a campus advisory board of folks that helped me as the director execute the plans of the Center for Civic Engagement. We brought all those folks together and came up with what we call the tenets of civic engagement and productive dialogue. And it's really a set of principles that we try to, we remind people of them every time we have a session, every time we have a gathering, every time we convene a conversation. And they're just reminders of how we would want that to go, right? Where we employ honest listening, we treat people respectfully, we look for ways to agree, not just disagree. And I think that helps set the table. That helps remind people, okay, we're not here to yell at each other. We're not here to point fingers, as you say. And that, I think, helps us. It has helped us quite a bit because it grounds the discussion from the start where we want it to be. And at times, people might get, they might get a little rambunctious, right? We just remind folks, hey, look, I understand how you feel that way, but let's tone it down a little bit.
Have you found that in facilitating that kind of discourse and that productive conversation between people of opposing point of views and similar point of views, have you found that when it comes down to it, at the end of those conversations, they're finding some middle ground, or at least, at the very least, an understanding of the other's point of view.
Absolutely. I think that there is, and we've seen this with all of the things that we have done, a deep desire for a place where that kind of conversation can happen. And folks really do, I think, find it valuable and enlightening to be able to say, okay, I came in here thinking one thing. Maybe I didn't change my mind, but at least I understand where the other person's coming from. And I think that can help lower the rhetoric, help ratchet it down in a lot of ways.
Professor David Dulio of Oakland University, professor of political science, and the director of Oakland University's Center for Civic Engagement. Any lasting advice for us to navigate the rhetoric, to find some common ground with people that we may not agree with before we let you go today?
I think if you're on social media, think before you type. I think that would be one lasting piece of advice I would give. You don't have to say the nastiest thing in the world to make your point.
Sometimes it's best to type something into a Word document, get the words out, and then just delete it.
There you go.
Professor David Dulio, professor of political science at Oakland University, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.